Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series on the history of Constantinople. Yesterday we kicked it off with a live discussion on the role of the city as the imperial capital of Byzantium with Professor Judith Heron. Today we're going to look at the city from a different angle, rooted in the present somewhat. We'll look at the role of Constantinople as a spiritual hub of Orthodox Christianity, the Patriarchate in recent history and in the 21st century, and the importance of the Phanar for worldwide Orthodoxy. Joining us to share his expertise is a regular on our podcast and at HALC events in New York, Professor George Demacopoulos. George Demacopoulos is a specialist in the history of Christianity and is the Father John Meyendorff and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies and the co-director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. Professor Demacopoulos, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So as I mentioned in our intro, we discussed the history of Constantinople as the capital of the Byzantine Empire yesterday, exploring its importance from late antiquity to 1453. And aside from being the seat of imperial power, which came to end with the conquest of the city by the Ottomans, it was also the seat of the Ecumenical Patriarch. And a lot of important decisions were made there from ecumenical councils and more. I want to pick up where our story left off.
Okay.
Can you give us a sense of what did the conquest of the city of Constantinople by the Ottomans mean for the Ecumenical Patriarchate moving forward? And what was the role of the Patriarchate throughout the life of the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, the seizure of Constantinople by the Ottomans really almost completely transformed the role of the Ecumenical Patriarch in society. Obviously, the Ecumenical Patriarch was an important personality in Byzantine civilization. But in Byzantine civilization, he was often subjected to oversight, even harassment by various emperors. And so there was this kind of, there was often this competition and tension between the imperial court and the patriarchal court. And with the emergence of the Ottomans in Constantinople, in many ways, the Ecumenical Patriarch actually had more power and more authority over Orthodox Christians than he had previously. The sultans, now obviously we're talking about a very long period of time, and there's some I'm speaking in generalizations, but as a general rule, the sultans gave the Ecumenical Patriarch almost complete autonomy to serve as the spiritual and cultural leader of Christians within the Ottoman Empire, which the territory of the Ottoman Empire encompassed much of what had been Byzantium and even more. And so in some ways, the power of the the authority and prestige of the Ecumenical Patriarch in some ways increased in the Ottoman period.
Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship that the Patriarch had with Christian subjects in the Ottoman Empire? What did that look like in terms? Was it essentially kind of a continuation of its role during the Byzantine Empire?
So in many respects, yes, it is a continuation, right? The Orthodox ecclesiological model, which is the fancy word for how the church is structured, in principle remain the same, right? The bishop of any local city is the presiding hierarch, but the Christian world, the structure of the Christian world, how one bishop relates to another bishop, very much was modeled on the way that the Byzantine Empire functioned. So ecclesiastically speaking, or liturgically speaking, all bishops are equal. But administratively speaking, bishops are not equal. There's a hierarchy there. There are bishops, there are auxiliary bishops or assistant bishops, and then from bishops there are metropolitans. And then from metropolitans, there are autocephalous leaders, often called patriarchs. And then even among the autocephalous leaders, there is a sort of structured hierarchy there, with the Ecumenical Patriarch being the first among equals. after the 11th century, when the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church broke communion. That remains the same in later Byzantium and in the Ottoman period. What changes, of course, is the political structuring that links a metropolitanate to a city, to a broader jurisdiction. All of that gets turned on its head because the Ottoman imperial political subdivisions are different than the Byzantine ones. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, the church will map to the new realities, and in some cases it won't. So it all gets rather confusing when you try to map all of this out. In a general sense, the patriarch's jurisdictional authority is much like what it had been before, but there will be constant changes to this, and it needs to be said, there was no time in the Byzantine Empire when these borders were static. Right. These borders were constantly changing throughout the history of the Byzantine Empire as well.
You mentioned that under the Ottoman Empire, the church had a little bit more freedom to operate than it did under the Byzantine emperors. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that? And do we see the church going into like a self-preservation mode during the Ottoman Empire, which is something that we've heard about in the past during the Turkokratia, when we talk about it in Greek schools and stuff?
Right.
Or, I mean, do we see a lot of theological works being published coming out of Constantinople? What's the activity look like?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot here, and let me be specific. When I said that the church had a little more autonomy under the Ottomans, what I meant by that was there was no Christian political leader who was intervening in the life of the church the way that the Byzantine emperors routinely had. And if we know our Byzantine history well, we will know that the moments of greatest crisis for the church were always moments when the Byzantine emperors had themselves inserted their power over the church, whether we're talking about iconoclasm or whatever, right? So the church doesn't suffer from the undue constant meddling of Christian political power during the Ottoman period. And as a consequence, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, in a sense, has more free reign to govern the Christian population under the Ottomans than it did under the Byzantines. But that doesn't mean that the Christians are free to do whatever they want. That is absolutely not the case. And the sultans place a number of really important constrictions on the church that really limit its freedom. First and foremost, the patriarch was always selected by the sultan, or if not directly selected by the sultan, if the Christians could put forward a candidate, the sultan had the right to veto that candidate. And if you know your Ottoman period well, you will know that rival Christian groups would routinely bribe the sultan, so that if there was a patriarch in power that they didn't like, they could pay the sultan a lot of money. The sultan would exile the patriarch and then put in a new candidate. Another thing to keep in mind is that the sultans would never allow a patriarch who had a friendly disposition to Western Christians, right? So you have a very long period of time when it was absolutely forbidden. It was an impossibility that you could have an ecumenically minded patriarch, because the absolute last thing that the sultans of the Ottoman Empire wanted was for Orthodox Christians to be on good terms with Catholic Christians. Because if Orthodox Christians were on good terms with Catholic Christians, that raised the possibility of a new crusade or military intervention from the West that would come to liberate Christians. So the Sultan's number one priority was always selecting patriarchs who had a poor who had a poor sentimentality for the West, right? You could never have a patriarch who thought well of the West.
So we've recently just celebrated and commemorated the Greek independence on March 25th. And that was a momentous moment in the history of the Ottoman Empire and in the history of the Ecumenical Patriarchate as well, where we see the revolt led to the public execution of the emperor then in Constantinople.
The Patriarch, yes.
Sorry, the Patriarch. What did these independence movements from Greece to Serbia to Bulgaria, how did they change the relationship that the Patriarchate had with Christians in the Ottoman Empire and in the Orthodox world?
Yeah, I don't think we can overstate just how much those independence movements completely changed modern Orthodoxy. Specifically to your question, because the Ecumenical Patriarch was the leader of the Genus, the leader of the Christian body under the Ottomans, he was the visible representative of Christians. And so when Christians in one part of the Ottoman territories, particularly because they were Greek-speaking, rebelled and declared independence and killed Turks and so forth, the Patriarch in Constantinople became the symbol of that insurrection and was dealt with accordingly. He was lynched. He was literally lynched at the front gate of the Patriarchate. And that sort of thing went on, as such that there was, as the rebellions, as the insurrections grew in the various throughout the Balkans, the Ecumenical Patriarchate was forced to try to tell people in the outlying regions not to do this, because of the way it would boomerang on Christians in Constantinople. Right. This is an unfortunate reality. This is simply the way that what happens with political movements, right, and the violence that comes with them, right. There's always a repercussion somewhere. So that sort of explains what's going on in Constantinople. But to the point with which I began, the way in which these independence movements completely transformed modern Orthodoxy is that when the Greek state emerged, they wanted their own church that was free of the Ottomans. And so they declared the Church of Greece out of nothing. Like, there was no Church of Greece. It didn't exist. Right. The Church of Greece, as a separate thing, it didn't exist. The Church of Greece kind of emerged out of nothing, and it was literally part of the rhetoric of revolution that we would have our own independent church, or that the Greeks would. And so that then became ecclesiastically distinct and separate from Constantinople. But then the exact same thing happened in Romania, and then it happened in Serbia, and eventually it happened in Bulgaria. And so you had all of these territories, which had been Christian for a very, very long time, but had never been autocephalous or independent. They all, like wildfire, developed their own independent churches, such that throughout the entire Byzantine period, there, depending on when we're talking about, there were maybe 6 or 7 autocephalous churches. Now we have, depending on how you count, anywhere from 14 to 16, and they all map onto this kind of the breakup. They largely map onto the breakup of the Ottoman Empire.
Right, and that's the perfect segue right there: the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the modern Turkish state in the early 20th century, 1923, to talk about what impact that had on the Phanar, because that's a monumental shift in how Turkey was governed, and its relationship with the Sultan obviously doesn't matter anymore because there's a new government in Ankara, not in Constantinople. So what is the relationship for the Phanar like with the modern Turkish state in the 20th and the 21st century?
Yeah, so the irony really is that a secular Turkey, modern Turkish state, has actually been in many ways far more oppressive to the Christians of Turkey than the Christians ever experienced under the Ottomans. I mean, in different ways. So today, one of the things that maybe your audience doesn't fully appreciate is many of the decisions of the early 20th century that the Turks took toward the Ecumenical Patriarch were not actually direct interventions to the Patriarchate. They were second degree consequences of the way that they were dealing with Islam. Right. So because you could no longer one of the things that the Turkish state had done was it put an end to a leading Muslim cleric. Right. So under the Ottomans, there had been a single Muslim leader. Right. Mm-hmm. And because Turkey wanted to have a secular state that would separate the government from Islam, and there could no longer be a sultan, or there could no longer be this leading Muslim cleric. So too, then, that meant that there could no longer be a single Christian leader as well, right? So many of the things that had happened to the Patriarchate were the second degree consequence of how the Turkish state was dealing with the secularization of Islam. Now, jump forward to the present day, you have a revival of Islam. You have a revival, at least coming from the Turkish president, right? You have a revival of Islam. You have a kind of a desecularization process happening in Turkey. But the Christians are not benefiting from that, right? So they suffered with the secularization process in the early 20th century. They are not benefiting today. So the current situation is that throughout the 20th century, through a very specific targeting, the Turks instituted a series of policies that led to the confiscation of something like 97% of the property owned by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The Ecumenical Patriarch does not have legal standing in Turkey. All of the religious objects, the relics, the Bibles, the ancient artifacts and so forth, those do not belong legally, according to Turkish law. Those do not belong to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. They belong to the citizens of Turkey. The Ecumenical Patriarch cannot be called the Ecumenical Patriarch, right? Because it has this because that would imply a universal jurisdiction. In the eyes of Turkish law, the Ecumenical Patriarch is nothing more than the Bishop of Constantinople, right? And on and on and on and on, right? There have been these series of things. In 1971, I believe, the Turkish government closed the last Orthodox seminary.
Yeah, HALC seminary.
The HALC seminary, right? It just on and on and on. There are all of these things that have been real sort of egregious acts of religious oppression that have occurred in what is theoretically a secular state and a member of NATO and so forth.
Right. So like I mentioned early on, we will accept questions in the comments. So if you have questions, please post them in the comments. And I've got a question right now that I'll pull up and I'll read it to you, George, so that you could answer it. But you referred to the way that revolutions and independence movements in the Balkans changed Orthodoxy. How does the autocephalous Ukrainian church change Orthodoxy and affect the Ecumenical Patriarchate today? That question is from Andy Zemenides.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Look, the reality is that the jurisdictions of the Orthodox world have always belatedly mirrored geopolitical realities. So the way that the autocephalous churches were set up in Byzantium reflected the provincial governance of the way the Roman Empire was mapped, right? And literally the maps are 1-to-1. And so after the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, each of these new nation states, right? These had not been nation states before. The whole nation state model is invented by the French, right? In the late 18th century. These new nation states in Greece and Albania and Serbia and Romania, Bulgaria, what have you, these all create a new geopolitical reality that over the next 100 years the church catches up to, so that the Church of Greece has its own, the nation of Greece has its own church, the nation of Serbia has its own church, the nation of Romania has its own church. Okay, so fast forward now to Ukraine, right? There had been a movement for Ukrainian autocephaly that stretched back to the very beginning of the 20th century, if not earlier. That movement was cut short by the Bolsheviks and communism, the Soviets, and so forth. And now, 30 years after the breakdown, the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were people in Ukraine who were agitating for its own independence, modeled on much like what had happened in the Balkans in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it had always been the case that the Ecumenical Patriarch, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, sometimes 30 years after the fact, would eventually recognize the independence of those churches. And this is precisely what the Ecumenical Patriarch did in the Ukraine. Now, not everybody liked that, of course. That's something of a different story. But what has happened in Ukraine simply follows a model of ecclesiastical jurisdiction or ecclesiastical mapping following broader geopolitical realities.
And you mentioned there's some that don't like it, and it's safe. We could say that that's Russia.
That's principally Russia, but not only Russia. Yeah.
What can you tell us about the disagreement with Russia between Moscow and Constantinople? And what do you see any political and historical repercussions for the decision by the Patriarch to grant autocephaly to the Ukrainian Church for worldwide Orthodoxy?
Yeah. So, well, obviously, right, a fully independent Ukrainian church, and we're not quite there yet because not all the churches, not all the parishes and bishops in Ukraine have embraced this new church, right? It's split, right? But if that were to happen, this would be a significant blow to the size, reach, influence of the Russian church. I've seen estimates from as many as 40 to 50% of the active participants in the Russian Orthodox Church writ large actually reside within Ukraine. So there are more people who live in the country of Russia than in the country of Ukraine, but there are more active churchgoers in Ukraine than there are in Russia. So that explains that disconnect. So nonetheless, an independent church of Ukraine significantly cuts the size and influence of the Church of Russia, if you're just thinking in those kinds of terms. So, not surprisingly, the Patriarch of Moscow and other global leaders who are, for a variety of reasons, aligned with him, objected to this move by the Ecumenical Patriarch. They objected to the move by the Ukrainians who asked for it. And, it has always been the case when these things happen that they are messy. It has never been the case that autocephaly has been granted and everyone has been happy about it. Right. That's just the messiness of the fallen world in which we live.
So we have a question that is we've got a lot of questions actually that came in, but I'm going to get to this last one because it's directly related to what we're talking about, and it's from Michael Konidadis. who asks, what is Russia's role in the future of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and worldwide Orthodoxy? Is it realistic to believe that the Ecumenical Patriarchate may one day move out of Istanbul or Constantinople to Russia or Moscow?
I find it, I can't look 200 years into the future, right? I find it very hard to believe that the Ecumenical Patriarchate would move to Russia. It is entirely possible for a period of time that the Ecumenical Patriarchate might be forced to move somewhere. It would probably be somewhere within its jurisdiction, which is not Moscow, right? So New York, Geneva, right, Australia. I mean, I'm just throwing names out there for places that are within its jurisdiction. I mean, this has happened before during the Fourth Crusade. The Ecumenical Patriarchate moved into Turkey, right? Turkey, Asia Minor proper, right? Because they didn't have Constantinople, and they were outside of Constantinople for more than 60 years, or nearly 60 years. So this sort of thing could theoretically happen. I find it very hard to believe that it would go to Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church is significant. It is far more diverse than anybody understands. Americans, Greeks, they see Putin, they see Patriarch Kiril, they assume they're on the same page. They assume they speak for all bishops and priests in Russia. That's not the case at all. The Russian Orthodox Church is incredibly diverse. It is by far and away the largest of the churches in terms of active participants today. It is also, because of the support from Putin and wealthy Russians, it is also the wealthiest church. All of this is the case, and a lot of good can come from that. But it's also the case that, at least recently, the Patriarch of Moscow has done a series of things to try to assert himself as the global leader of Orthodoxy in a way that matches his wealth. And but the fact of the matter,
do you think he tries to usurp the title ecumenical? That's another question that just came in.
Well, I've never seen him do something like that, but I have seen him do. The kinds of things that try to project an alternative, or to build a kind of alternative constituency to the Ecumenical Patriarch, right? So the Ecumenical Patriarch is very well known for being open to the West, being open to modernity, being open to not only ecumenical relations, but interfaith relations, and so forth. The Patriarch of Moscow has tried to build a different kind of constituency, one that is more inward-looking, one that is more rooted in a kind of traditional values language, and so forth. One that is a little less ecumenical, a little less modern, a little more retroactive, and so forth, and tries to build a constituency accordingly. But the fact of the matter is, the way the Orthodox world works, the leaders of the autocephalous movements or the autocephalous churches are symbolic of their jurisdiction. Patriarch Kiril represents, in a kind of iconic way, Russian Orthodoxy, right? Patriarch Daniel in Romania represents Romanian Orthodoxy. The Ecumenical Patriarch, probably because he has no political authority at all, right, has very limited financial resources, he is the only one who in his person and in his history can represent global Orthodoxy, right? So he doesn't have the wealth, he doesn't have the power, he doesn't have the population like, say, the Patriarch of Moscow has. But because of the history and the legacy of Byzantium, and because he is ecumenical, the Ecumenical Patriarch, he's the only one who can kind of iconically represent global Orthodoxy.
So we have another question bringing us back to the challenges that you mentioned for the Patriarchate in the 20th and 21st century. And it's from Dino Gerousis, who asks, what countries besides Greece or Cyprus are putting pressure on Turkey in support of the Ecumenical Patriarchate's rights? And are any of these effective? Any of these?
Yeah, so the probably the single greatest ally that the Ecumenical Patriarch has had in the 20th and 21st century is actually the United States. It was a call from the U.S. president that actually had Hagia Sophia turned into a museum in the mid 20th century or early 20th century, and so I'm an archon of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the archons, their principal task is to defend the patriarch. But what that means in practical terms is that we do our best to kind of function as a lobbying organization in DC and in Brussels to explain the situation to U.S. congressmen and senators and congresswomen who might not fully appreciate precisely just how precarious the situation for the Patriarchate is, and to try to get the U.S. government to apply political pressure to Turkey, which is a NATO partner, theoretically, to release the pressure on the Patriarchate. And, it has both been successful and unsuccessful in that task, right? They've achieved certain things, and they've helped, but yet, Erdogan, the pressure is there, right? Erdogan is keeping it up. There are people in Turkey who are trying to keep up the pressure, and it's a precarious situation. I mean, I've seen numbers as low as there are 2,000 active Christians in Turkey. It's a nation of 80 million people, right? I mean, that's an astonishing that's an astonishing demographic challenge.
And you mentioned earlier the Patriarchate's constituency, where he has, not a lot of political capital in Turkey, at least, not a lot of Christians in Turkey that you just mentioned, especially within the Greek Orthodox community. I know the Armenian numbers maybe is slightly bigger, but even there, definitely. it's not what it obviously was 100 years ago. But what can you tell us about the Greek Orthodox churches that are administered by the Phanar here in the United States? Because this seems to be one of the largest constituencies here. What's his relationship with Orthodox Christian diaspora?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So in practical terms, any Orthodox Christian of Hellenic descent who finds him or herself somewhere in the world that isn't part of the ancient churches, right? So in North and South America, Australia, even Western Europe, Africa. Well, no, not Africa. North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe. If they are of Hellenic descent, more likely than not, they belong to a diocese and to parishes that are under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, right? So my father, who was born in Greece, came to the United States in the 1950s, effectively switched autocephalous churches when he moved, right? He grew up as part of the Church of Greece. He came to the United States, joined a parish in Chicago. That put him under the Ecumenical Patriarch, right? So the same if you're in Australia, New Zealand, Buenos Aires, wherever you are. Now, it's also been the case, of course, that other historic churches, the Church of Russia, the Church of Serbia, the Church of Romania, they have also seen their own diaspora. And they have typically to a lesser extent, but nonetheless on the same kind of model, develop their own parishes, dioceses, and so forth, literally across the globe. Mm-hmm. And so the Church of Greece and the Church of Cyprus do not have their own active diaspora. They sort of default and let those churches, they let those Christians fall under the Ecumenical Patriarch. But most of the others have established their own jurisdictions.
So you mentioned your work with the archons advocating for the religious freedom of the Patriarchate and for its rights here in the United States. This question comes from Dina Lonistiotis, who asks, what can the diaspora do to advocate on behalf of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in any capacity?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, what we need to do is begin by educating our own communities. Most of our own communities really have no sense for just how bad the situation for the Patriarchate is. They don't realize that, for example, the Patriarch has no legal standing in Turkey, that the Patriarch isn't allowed to be called Ecumenical Patriarch, that 97% of the property that the Patriarchate owned, even within the last 60, 70 years, has all been confiscated by the Turkish state, right? That used to be the source of its revenue, its income, so that it could fulfill its ministries. All of that has disappeared. So I would say the first and foremost is sponsor events at your parishes where you can bring in somebody who knows this material and can disseminate it. Once from there, we can work with various bodies within the U.S. government, whether it's the State Department, Congress, what have you, to apply pressure. Of course, pray. I mean, I don't say that flippantly, right? I mean, as Christians, we believe in the power of prayer, and so forth. So I would say that those are some of the things that we can do.
And that's one of the goals that we have with this series too, and bringing experts like you on to tell us about all these issues. Moving a little bit away from the challenges that the Patriarchate faces, I want to focus on the Patriarchate and Patriarch Bartholomew specifically as a leader on social issues. And we know he's been called the Green Patriarch, for example, for his leadership on the environment. And most recently, he demonstrated leadership in his decision to effectively shut services and halt them to combat the coronavirus pandemic. Can you give us a better understanding of how the Patriarchate is leading on social issues and making a difference there?
Yeah, the Ecumenical Patriarch is really extraordinary. I mean, before being an environmentalist was cool, right? Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew was really out there giving a series of high-level talks and writing about the environment, and from a purely theological perspective, right? I mean, if you believe in God as creator, and if you believe in humanity as the stewards of God's creation, then, there's your environmentalism 101, right? It really is that simple. And yet, Patriarch Bartholomew was really the first significant Orthodox theologian to make this a kind of a really strong emphasis of his ministry, and he has brought many, many others along. I mean, for example, Pope Francis 3 or 4 years ago issued his own really important encyclical on the environment, one of the first popes to do so, and he did so by beginning his treatise by quoting the Ecumenical Patriarch. There had never been a papal document in modern times that had quoted a living Ecumenical Patriarch, right? So I think that gives you a sense of just how influential and well regarded the patriarch is on environmental issues. But it's not just environmental.
Right.
He's also been really active on issues such as human trafficking. He was very active during the refugee crisis, as was the Church of Greece, to its credit. He's been a leader in trying to develop nonviolence movements and coordination among religious leaders of all faiths. He actually has very good relations with Islamic leaders. I mean, you have to understand he's surrounded by Muslims,
right.
and having a sort of relationship of self-respect or of respect and coexistence is essential to the survival of Christianity in the Middle East, and he's been leading on that sort of thing as well.
Can you talk a little bit more about that interfaith dialogue? It seems to be an important aspect of what the patriarch does, and we've seen him engage with both Catholic leaders and the Pope, Islam, as you mentioned, and other religions. What role is he playing there, and what's the end goal?
Yeah, well, okay, so I mean, one thing we have to understand. I mean, those of us who grew up in the West, we think that Islam is this kind of this new threat or this new right, or we're afraid of terrorism, we're afraid of this, we're afraid of that, but Orthodox Christians have been living alongside Muslims for 1,300 years, and in fact, until about this is going to shock you, but until about the 18th century, right, the majority of Christians who had ever lived as a minority population under an Islamic political leader. Right. I mean, let that sink in. Right. The majority of Christians who had ever been alive prior to the 18th century lived under an Islamic political leadership. Right. And the reason that number is so astonishing to us is because we don't really have a full sense of historical demographics. There are far more people in the Middle East in the Middle Ages than there were in Western Europe. Right. And so there were millions of Christians in places like Iraq and even Iran and so forth in the Middle East. So the Ecumenical Patriarch who knows this tradition, who draws upon this tradition, has lived it his entire life, understands that being a person of faith requires you to see God in everyone. Right. Yes, I believe in the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and I believe that compels me to live my life in a certain way. But part of that living my life in a certain way means that whoever the person standing in front of me is, no matter what they believe, no matter what they do, they were still created in the image and likeness of God. Right. And the way I treat that person, whether they're a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu or whatever, they still have the image and likeness of God within them. And the patriarch understands that, right? In a way that people who are not in proximity to other religious traditions simply don't. Right. And so he's been right. And that's the end goal, right? It's the end goal is to be the best Christian possible, right? And to understand that in the refugee, in the migrant, in the person standing in front of you, is to see God within them.
So I've got two more questions because I know we want to be respectful of your time. But building off of this, how is the ecumenical nature of these dialogues affecting the view of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in other Orthodox circles, maybe more traditional ones, like you mentioned, Russia, which is taking a tack that's much more conservative?
Yeah, so it depends, right? The vast majority, certainly the vast majority of bishops in what we call the diaspora. Right. Are by the very virtue of where they are in their proximity to others, they are ecumenical to some degree or another. The Patriarch Kiril is interesting, the Patriarch of Moscow. He's interesting because at one and the same time, he or at least his handlers, right, will present him as someone who is the defender of Orthodox tradition and therefore skeptical of too much ecumenical outreach, right? In other words, trying to juxtapose him to the Ecumenical Patriarch. But at one and the same time, he has even himself taken steps within the last 5 or 10 years to be more ecumenical. So literally just this week, he sent a letter to all of the leaders of the ancient Christian traditions that celebrated Easter this past week. So the Pope of Rome, and others, wishing them well for Easter, right? So even Patriarch Kiril is moving more in an ecumenical direction, in part, I would argue, probably because he's following the lead of the Ecumenical Patriarch himself.
So I want to wrap up with the last question, and the question we just got that was submitted, I think, is a great, ties in with it as well. So I'll include it. But can you give us a look ahead? What does the 21st century look like for you for the Phanar, and what are the challenges that lie ahead? And Peter Corbakis makes an interesting point here, where he asks, praying it's not for many, many years, but when it is time for succession, do we have the power to ensure that Turkey accepts our next patriarchal election? And because I believe they still need to approve in some way.
Yeah. So I'll be honest. It's hard for me to see what's going to happen in the 21st century. In this century, we're 20% of the way through, right? It's hard to tell only because things are moving fast. But things change, right? It's hard for me to know what's going to happen after Erdogan, right? I think a lot depends on the direction of Turkish society as a whole, and Turkish society is really, really diverse, right? Erdogan does not really, like, his views of church and state do not represent the majority view within Turkey. And so it's unclear what direction Turkey's going to take. I think the direction that the nation state of Turkey takes will in many ways shape the parameters of the on the ground possibilities for the Patriarchate. I mean, it's sad for me to say that the direction of the Patriarchate will be shaped by things it has no control over and things that are openly hostile to it. But I think that's a kind of historical reality. In terms of elections, two things to know. First, according to Turkish law, a candidate for the Patriarchate of Turkey is supposed to be a Turkish citizen. And the Turkish government has the right to veto whoever the Synod of Bishops selects. Now, all rules can be broken, and they have been. Athenagoras was not a Turkish citizen, for example. And one of the ways in which the archons and other advocates for the Patriarchate have been successful in recent years is they have managed to allow clerics within the global jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to apply for Turkish citizenship rather than just having to have been born in Turkey. So this has been possible for maybe the last 10 years or so. I'm confident that there are good candidates. Again, me too. I hope it's way off into the future. There are some good candidates in the pipeline, so to speak, that could be the next patriarch. I don't know exactly how it will play out because we don't know when it's going to play out. This is the state of the situation at the present.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Professor Demacopoulos. It's been great having you on again, speaking to our members about all these really important issues. And for everybody who's paying attention, we have a great list of events lined up, both this week on the history of Constantinople with some great speakers. So check those out on our Facebook page. And next week, we will be partnering with the Embassy of Greece to do a series on the 2500 year anniversary of the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. So check those out as well. George, thank you again. Have a great Easter, and a happy Easter to everybody who will be celebrating this Sunday. Kalia Anastasia, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, in pieces. Thank you.